Okay, great. Hi, everyone. This is Desmond from the BeyondTheEdge doctoral network. Um, yeah. Today we have the pleasure to have Professor Daniele Marinazzo here with us. And the topic of today's seminar will be related to the collective behaviors in complex systems. Um, yeah. So first, let me introduce Professor Daniele in a short way. Our speaker, Professor Daniele Marinazzo, is a professor in the Department of Data Analysis at Ghent University in Belgium. He has a very strong background in statistical physics, and his research focus on the dynamics and structure of complex systems, which connects theoretical and computational physics with the methodological and computational approaches, mainly in the neuroscience and experimental um, neurophysiology. And also in the academic community, Professor Marinazzo serves as the deputy editor at PLOS Computational Biology and the co-editor-in-chief at Neurons, Behavior Data Analysis and Theory. Also, he holds the academic editor positions with the network neuroscience and imaging neuroscience and brain topography. Okay, so that's the brief introduction of our speaker today. So the floor is yours, Professor Daniel.
Thanks. I will share my screen. So now the usual question, do you see the actual presentation or the presenter view?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, so it's nice. Okay, so thanks a lot for the invitation. So in case there are technical issues, please let me know. But more importantly, if you have some questions while I am presenting things, it's even better, so we can have a better interaction. So thanks for this invitation. So I will present something which is quite, let's say, general and at the same time specific to what I'm doing. Also because I mean, at the beginning, your colleague asked me to present something about more network reconstruction from EEG data with some nonlinear aspects. I will maybe cover some of this, but let's say that this is more something that I'm investigating nowadays, and which also answer hopefully the question of why I'm not so much, at least anymore, in reconstructing networks from at least pairwise network from neuroimaging data. But anyway, let's get started. So when we study the brain, but also other functions, and if you want also other aspects outside of neuroscience, this is something which is quite general. We have some observables that can be the network structure, the activity, and then some statistical patterns between these activities. The ultimate goal, on the other hand, is to make sense of the interaction between different brain areas, different body parts, different parts of the complex system that we want to study. So, given that we are starting with an example in neuroscience, let's take as a paradigm of this trying to make sense of collective but yet specialized behavior. We could take as an example the lab by Jerry Edelman of the end of last century, where there were two PhD students at the time, one Giulio Tononi and the other one Olaf Sporns, and the two of them sort of embraced this kind of complementary view that on one hand it's important to have specialization of some functions, and on the other hand those functions needs to be integrated. So Giulio Tononi went towards the study of consciousness, developing the integrated information theory. On the other hand, Olaf Sporns went towards more network science and became, let's say, if you want, the father of network neuroscience. So this synergy between different areas and different functions happens at multiple scales, both temporal scales and spatial scales, ranging from what happens at the synapses, but even in the molecules within the synapses and so on, up to what happens in the whole system and also in social networks. And then the scales go from very fast events up to evolution, if you want. And so in this sense, let's say it's important to make sense of this integration. Now, in neuroscience, we sort of became obsessed with this integration thing at the point of renaming a simple thing such as correlation, even though functional connectivity is something that is, let's say, used, also for other tools such as coherence, amplitude envelope correlation or whatever. But let's say that in general, and most of the time, is a correlation, and in all cases is statistical dependencies between recordings. But yet we called it with another name. We called it functional connectivity. We'll see later the pros and cons of this mindset. So when I started working in the field a few decades ago, let's say there were this idea of you can have directional links such as correlation, undirected links such as correlation, coherence, etc., and then directed links such as the transfer entropy or dynamic causal models, etc. On the other hand, let's say those functional links we are mentioning anyway suppose a mechanism behind them. So even if we just have correlation in our toolkit, which is not the case, and it's good to have better measures than correlation, but even if we would only have correlation, unless we admit that we are randomly trying to perform correlation between different time series and hope that we get a high value and then we can publish a nice paper. The idea is that we use those correlation to answer some questions that we ask ourselves about the system and saying, okay, those two measurements are supposed to be related by some kind of mechanism. And I'm trying to probe them with the statistical dependencies. Now, in some cases, those measures are explicitly called causality, like the Granger causality, but it is not, or the dynamic causal models, etc. In other cases, they are not. The thing is that what is actually the causality, which is the causality definition we want to embrace when we look for dependencies between time series in our observation. So there are at least two distinct ways, not exclusive, that one can think of causality. So either we can think about temporal precedence, or we can talk about some control of the system. So those two don't imply our Aristotelic causality. In particular for neuroscience, either we can expect that those measures recapitulate the exact physiological influences happening between neural populations, and this is usually something addressed with generative models of brain activity, even though we will never have a perfect or an omnicomprehensive model to generate the whole brain. but then this is something that speaks to the mechanism. On the other hand, we can have a different, but to observe the directed connectivity from the dynamics or also from static data without requiring that the networks recapitulate exactly the process. So we can look at, if you want, the effects and not the causes, or the behaviors rather than the mechanism. And this we commonly observe it. So, for example, at least in large-scale neuroscience data, the same underlying network structure, so-called the structural connectivity, can subserve. And actually here I'm using some causal language like give rise, but on the other hand, everything is sort of connected, but it's not that the physical connectivity produces the dynamic of connectivity, or this is not always the case. And then, of course, this is true for both cases above, both for the models and for the statistical dependencies. Usually, we are not able to measure all the relevant variables that we would like to. So, in which sense the functional connectivity, as defined earlier, is causal? So normally, when we talk of functional connectivity as the correlations or the coherence or whatever, so the statistical association between the measure and that we have, we are somehow confusing the properties of interest normally, namely how different brain areas contribute to brain function by acting together, from the methods that we use to infer those properties. So the colleague that say, okay, but why then you don't just call them correlation? So on one hand, we have the methods. On one hand, we have the target properties. So to some extent, it's good to keep this conceptual distinction, just to remember that we have different levels of addressing the problem. And indeed, also colleagues who refrain from causal methods, such as, no, I will never use Granger causality, I will never use this one because causality it's impossible to address, at least in these ways, etc. Then they use causal language. They say, okay, I will remove, I will process my data because otherwise the movement will encode my data in this way, or this part of the brain decodes or is responsible for this. So causal language is with us, and it's a good thing because, I mean, answers, I mean, the questions that we ask about the brain, to be meaningful questions, they have to subserve or to imply some causal mechanism. So in this case, we have, if you want, different ontological levels in this field. So we have the mechanism that we want to characterize, but typically we cannot observe directly. So, for example, the actual neurons or neuron populations and their exact mechanism of interactions. Then we have the observational level. So what we can observe also in terms of confounders, etc. And then we need to estimate what our target properties or some properties about them from the observables and from the statistical dependency of observables. Mathematically, this can also be seen as a state space, which is actually at the base of many of those methods, not only of the dynamic causal model, which explicitly models the data that we don't see and the data that we see, but also in other data-driven measures, as we will see later on. So today, I will argue that we can use, in a wide sense, information to reason about the interpretations as we defined before and on several concepts. And those information is a convenient way to look at probability distributions that can be multivariate, that can comprise data from different sources. And also information in the sense of a model of our data that can by which we can define the non-randomness of our system, so the reduction in surprise when observing the system, can also accommodate some ideas in neuroscience such as learning, dimensionality reductions, etc. So we can then use information, and now I put it in marks because I haven't properly defined it yet, so this will come in a moment. But we can use information to navigate the inferential level, the one that we saw before, and to restrict our space of hypotheses to make more informed predictions about the system that we are about to study. So if we define information, if you want, a la Shannon, we can say that information is the amount by which one variable, which can be in a wide sense, answer, signal, measurements, even if Shannon only thought about signals, reduces our uncertainty or surprises us about itself or another variable. So indeed, Shannon quantified it using logarithms and probability distribution, and originally his definition was a way to describe communication. So for example, how wide needs a channel to be in order to pass a certain message, or how rich can a message be to fit through the particular communication channel. The thing is that in neuroscience, it's not always useful to, it's not always well defined, this Shannon framework, because indeed it's not clear what we can actually transmit, it's not clear the mechanism of transmission, and it's not clear how the transmission could be successful or wrong. So all this does not accommodate a Shannon theory of information. On the other hand, we can still think about entropy as counting bits rather than counting messages, and we can use mutual information or other measures as a model selection tool. In which way? Imagine that you want to make an inference about any type of interdependence between two variables, x and y, and so you want basically to compare a joint distribution and a description without the two marginals together. And so in this case, mutual information, as defined as the log likelihood ratio here, is basically a measure of the effect size of the interdependence. So you have the bits associated with the interdependency in terms of the bits used or needed to reproduce the randomness of the variable separately, and then the bits necessary to reproduce the behavior of the variables together. Also, Granger causality can be seen in this sense because it's just, if you want, a mutual information condition on the path of the candidate target variable. And so the principle of Granger causality, which is also true for so-called model-free estimations such as the transfer entropy or so, is that the cause precedes in time its effect, and the cause contains unique information about the future value. Yet, Granger causality, and this we need to always keep it in mind, is a measure of the effect and not of the cause. So it's a measure of the behavior and not of the mechanism. So it does not exactly recapitulate what is happening at the level of the data being generated. So if we have a multivariate model, so not only with the driver and target, we can define statistical dependencies in terms of shared variance. So we have the variance associated to one variable, the variance associated to two variables, and to the rest of the system. So in this case, we can observe partial variances of the system and try to infer, let's say, different coefficients of regression models in case of the original formulation of Granger causality, and determine how well we can predict the target given the information within itself and the information given in the rest of the system. We can also have other estimation distribution, such as, for example, the binning. The binning is not a very good measure for probability distribution unless you have very long data. Otherwise, anyway, you will always have a bias and you will have an estimator that will not work properly. Better estimator are definitely the nearest neighbor or Kraskov estimator that looks for data in a given embedding and see how data points that are closer at certain point in a certain hypercube of a given dimension keep staying within the same hypercube when the system evolves in the space of a state. Of course, it's a quite costly estimation. Sometimes you can mitigate the Kursor dimensionality using, for example, a non-uniform embedding. So trying to select in a greedy way the points that are more informative about the future of the system. But let's say that in several cases, those estimators can be problematic and we need more parsimonious estimators, both for pairwise measures and also for higher order measures. We will see this in a moment. When it is a case where you can effectively use nonlinear estimators, when you have a very long data and when you want to reconstruct, for example, the coupling between chaotic maps. We saw this some years ago when there was this challenge at the Neuroscience conference to retrieve the connections between some coupled systems. And in the case of coupled chaotic maps, indeed the non-uniform embedding was the best one to recover, actually with a perfect reconstruction, this mechanism. In other cases, this estimator was not successful at all, in particular when the data were shorter and so on. Now, going back to our previous example of the work of Tononi and the work of Sporns, we have talking about connectivity and dynamics, and then we introduce information. And actually, a couple of years ago, Olaf Sporns finally acknowledged the relevance of information as a third missing piece between connectivity and dynamics in order to make sense of this trade-off between differentiation and integration. As a matter of fact, the idea of network connectivity, connectomics, etc., has taken over a huge part of the field. This is the percentage of abstract at the Organization for Human Brain Mapping annual meeting. Now, when we talk about networks, now this you know better than me, but I will briefly recapitulate. We can think about network as pathways. So this is the famous Königsberg bridges that is said to have given rise to graph theory. And by the way, today would not have happened because we have 8 bridges. So the inhabitants will no longer have been asked themselves whether it was impossible or not to cross all the 7 bridges together. And then there is a second network characteristics, which is network as an expression of collective dynamics and functions. So this is a wider definition of a network, and basically responds to the idea that even if we perfectly know the individual components of a system, we are better served about what the system does by looking at how those individual parts are connected or behave together. This idea has been expressed in several fields. So let's start with the social sciences, with Adolphe Quetelet, which by the way was from Ghent. And he was well, an astronomer, but also a statistician. He was a kind of a big data scientist ante litteram, so he was sort of obsessed with characterizing the average man, the average person, let's say, by compiling a certain number of statistics. And when he was studying the tendency of a person to commit a criminal act, he brought forward the theory that each behavior, even criminal behavior, are somehow deviation, statistical deviation from an average, from the collective behavior. And this, of course, had some implication on free will and other theories. Now, these theories by Quetelet could, even if this is not demonstrated, have influenced also, but it was anyway something in the air, as it is the case with many ideas, influenced the ideas of Maxwell about the dynamic theory of gases. And then later on, Camillo Golgi, depicted in bottom right, and Santiago Ramon y Cajal shared in 1906 a Nobel Prize in Physics, coming from two different positions. So Golgi had invented a way to stain individual neurons. And so it was, for the first time, possible to observe the individual characteristics of the, individual players of brain functions, namely the neurons and their connections. And so Ramon y Cajal, using Golgi staining, derived many theories about brain function and also performed a lot of experiments. And it became convinced that the individuality of neurons was a crucial thing for brain functions. On the other hand, Golgi was sort of discontent about this interpretation of his own discovery. And they say that indeed, even if we can single out the behavior of individual cells, we need to consider them together to make sense of how the system works. So this is again this duality between differentiation and integration that we have seen at the beginning. Now, networks are a great thing. You know better than me that we need to go beyond a pairwise network representation. In neuroscience, this is particularly true. For example, in epidemiology and psychometrics, it has been widely known that things like confounders and colliders are important statistical objects that need to be taken into account to correctly answer causal questions about the system. On the other hand, in connectivity, in neuroscience, this thing is sort of quite new. Let's take a simple example of Granger causality, but also of correlation is the same. When you want to distinguish whether an influence is directed or mediated by other variables, you have a model of your target and you remove one variable at a time from your system. Now, imagine that you have several variables that share common information about the target, but of course, you don't know this in advance. So if you remove them one by one, your model of the target will not become worse because you still have the other three that convey information from the driver to the target. So even if the information from the driver to the target is conveyed through each of those four variables, if you consider them separately, your model will not become worse. And you will declare that none of these four variables are instrumental to convey information from the driver to the target. And this you cannot know it unless you don't look at the shared information between groups of variables. Other limits of pairwise network representation is, for example, the XOR gate, which is cannot be even conceived as a network with pairwise links, because in order to know the outcome, you need to know what the two inputs together are doing. And then also in machine learning and in feature representation, you see that some features alone are not predictive of a certain behavior or about another discrimination task, but they become so when combined. So this is basically your daily playground, I guess. So these higher order networks in terms of hypergraphs, implicit complexes, etc. When a few years ago, some colleagues published this paper of the physics of higher order interactions in complex systems, in which they were looking at higher order mechanisms. So, for example, higher order coupling in Kuramoto oscillators and so on. We thought that also for higher order, it was important to distinguish between behaviors and mechanisms. So what we observe from the actual links and the actual mechanism of the system. And this also reflects some other ideas. So for example, you can predict the dynamics of a multivariate system without requiring necessarily to know all the interactions between all the parts of the system that you want to predict. And so indeed, in that paper, they were looking at higher order couplings between variables. But on the other hand, we want to distinguish between mechanism and behavior. So mechanisms speak about how the system is structured, and behaviors are what the system does. So it looks at statistical dependencies between observables. And the same way happens in a storm of birds. And by the way, this a paper I published, a commentary on a paper by Giovanni Petri and some collaborators, in which they were indeed addressing the division between behaviors and mechanisms in higher order systems. So I encourage you to read not so much my paper, but yes, if you want the easy reading, yes, but the paper by Thomas Robiglio and colleagues, which has this nice distinction between higher order mechanisms and the signatures of these mechanisms. So when is particularly relevant the fact that you can have lower order, so pairwise mechanism, but higher order behaviors. For example, in the case of a Ising model, in this case you have a frustrated system of 3 spins in which the mechanism is pairwise, but the maximum of information we get about the system, we have it when considering a higher order behavior. Going back to how we can implement this, we go back to information, to mutual information, and we define now interaction information, which is basically a quantity which is invariant under permutation between the 3 variables. And so it's equal to the joint, the mutual information minus the conditional mutual information. And this example of this can be seen, for example, in Markov chains, whether they are actual chains or whether they present bifurcation, or in the data processing inequality, which states that processing cannot increase information. Now, this is an extension to 3 variables, and of course we can go far beyond. But let's start by an operationalization in mathematical terms of the concepts of synergy, which can address statistical and functional issues that we described so far. So information decomposition can help distinguish between unique information, synergistic information, and redundant information. And this is done, or can be done, among other things, by looking at multivariate probability distribution. So for example, if we have two variables that are used to predict the third one, we can define the total predictability and the information provided by only one of the two predictors. And so in some situation, it can happen that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And there are different ways of decomposing information. Some of them take redundancy and synergy as mutually exclusive quantities, like the interaction information decomposition, where you can say whether a system is prominently redundant or prominently synergistic, or the partial information decomposition that allows redundancy and synergy to coexist at the same time. Of course, nothing comes for free. You need some extra assumptions to accommodate this system. So going back to what we were saying before, to the predictive multivariate models, between here we have one target, one driver, and the rest of the system, we can start decomposing this information in terms of variances. So we can have the unexplained variance in the system in yellow, then we can have the information transfer in terms of partial variances, and also the interaction predictability in this case. Everything can be done by decomposing the variances. And this is the same decomposition that you would have if you use, on the other hand, pure entropy measures, such as obtained with decimators that are not based on covariance, knowing that for linear, for Gaussian processes, transfer entropy and Granger causality are equal, are equivalent, but a factor 0.5, and the same it happens for the relationship between covariance and mutual information. So we can have a breakdown of target information in terms of information storage, information transfer, information modification, and unexplained information. And this can be computed both as a decomposition of variance or a decomposition of entropy. In the same way, we can define redundancy when the two information transfer overlap, and synergy when they don't. There is an important distinction where you use logarithmic-based measures, is that given the fact that the logarithm is convex, the same amount of a reduction of variance in different places of the x-axis would not correspond to the same amount of changes in transfer entropy. And so if you use entropy measure, you have a bias towards synergy that needs to be mitigated with some correction or with some null distributions that take into account the fact that the logarithm is a non-convex function. Now, of course, if I would say, okay, you need to consider higher order networks, but then you should stop at triplets, then you say, well, why? Indeed, it's relevant to see how far can we go. It's not always necessary to go to higher order, but of course, if we want to go higher order, we need to consider the expansion even beyond order 3 with all its, let's say, possible benefits and also its additional costs. There are different approaches being developed towards the years, both for mutual information and for transfer entropy. A particularly convenient parsimonious one is the one developed by Fernando Rosas and colleagues, which is based on the difference between total correlation and dual total correlation, where total correlation is a measure of collective constraints, so basically a measure of redundancy, and dual total correlation is a proxy for shared randomness, or if you want, for synergy. And given that this formula is only based on the entropy, is something that scales conveniently with the number of variables. It's equal to the interaction information for 3 variables, but then the type of decomposition is different when we when we go to an order beyond 3. So Fernando and colleagues, this work with Andrea Lupi showed that there is a balance of synergy and redundancy at the level of the whole brain with some important differences. Redundancy is more present in the input-output areas of the brain, like the somatosensory cortex, etc., and the synergy is more present in higher cognitive areas. Also, comparing the human and the macaque data, so human and non-human primates, you see that the synergy is significantly higher for humans, while the redundancy is not. So synergy also has some cross-species, I mean, can say evolutionary, but we don't know, component. Another example can be seen in local field potential from recorded with some Neuralink probes in rodents. Here we can see above the redundant multiplets and below the synergistic one, and you can see that redundant multiplets of order 3, 4, 5, and 6 mostly comprises regions, contacts from the same anatomical regions. On the other hand, the synergistic multiplets contain variables from different brain areas. So this is a fact that spatial proximity is already a source per se of redundancy. And also, if you want, differentiation is also something that speaks to redundancy rather than to synergy. This decomposition can also be applied to artificial neural network. This is a case of a multi-layer neural network trying to learn some features. This case was the MNIST data sets of characters. And so we can see that the amount of synergy redundancy for different multiplet sizes is modulated across layers. And also, if we retrain the networks either with the random initial weights or with the weights based on the weights that have highest synergy, we see that the accuracy drops is smallest when we retrain the system on the synergistic weights. So synergy has a role in artificial neural network when they try to learn something. As another example, we can see psychological networks. Psychological networks are a construct now being used in psychology and psychometrics to make sense of the co-expression of different answers to questionnaires or symptoms of a disease across subjects. And so in this case, the idea is that the mechanism is the latent variable. So for example, you cannot measure depression itself, but you can measure fatigue, you can measure insomnia, loss of interest, suicidal thoughts, and so on. So in this case, you have a mechanism that subserve some observables. And the idea is to make sense of the interaction between these observables. And so the field of network psychometrics has been established in the last decades as a way of combining together either observables or latent variables and so on. Now, usually psychological networks look like the one that you see on top left, in which basically the modules of this network recapitulates the constructs of the latent factors. So here is a network of a questionnaire around empathy, and you have different constructs such as perspective taking, empathic concerns, and so on. So here is a nice visualization, but doesn't tell us much more about the fact that these observables correctly recapitulate the latent factors, which is already a good thing, but you have other measure of construct validity for this. On the other hand, if you use higher order information to look at this network, you can see that the redundancy again picks up the different modules, while the synergy picks up some items that are more central in terms of this psychometrics hypergraphs, and then could be more relevant to understand the modulation of empathy as a whole across the whole population. And this is another example on PTSD, also including covariates such as age, sex, and other scores. So in this sense, the latent factor could be the mechanism, and on the other hand, the statistical dependencies could be the behavior, going back to the distinction that we made before between mechanism and behavior. Also, transfer entropy can be expanded in the same way using a dynamic version of the information in which you condition on the past. So this is just an example that we performed on monkeys performing a detection task. And then you can have a local measure of information. So removing the logarithm, the integral or the sum from the definition of the entropy, you can see which points of the distribution mostly contribute to the total entropy or the total information, and which not. So, for example, even in a case of a unidirectionally coupled statistical systems, you have some points in time that don't contribute or are even misinformative with respect to the future of the target, while on average, you can see that the target is effectively predicted by the driver. In the same way, you can use the local version of the information to see which points, both in time or across subjects, are the ones that mostly contribute to local synergy or local redundancy. And this is, again, a case of a local O information in the frustrated easing system, and in the non-frustrated ones, that depending on the configuration of the spin, you can see whether you have some individual contribution to redundancy or synergy. When you have synergy in the non-frustrated system and redundancy in the frustrated one. There is another extension that we can consider, that is the gradients of O information. So far, we have used the higher order representation of the system, but on the other hand, you might want to say, okay, given a multivariate system, which are the individual variables or which are the pairs of variables that contribute most to the overall information in the system? And so in this case, we can compute the difference in O information when we add one variable or two variables or more to the system. And so in this case, we can have a measure which is a symmetric under permutation index, and which allows to not focus on the information of groups of variables, but at the variation of the total information in the system when we add one or two variables. So again, the first order gradients allow to disclose the central role of this particular spin here, and in a different way in a situation in which there is not a star, but there is a sort of chain between spins. And so in this case, we can see that we can have the spin 1 that is synergistic since it forms all the frustrated triangle, and then the second order gradients that contain the central pin are also synergistic, and then so on. Going back to the previous data, we can see that we can have that the individual sensors are mostly redundant, but then when taken in pairs, you can have some synergistic interactions, in particularly emerging when we take together sensors coming from different specialized brain areas, such as the hippocampus with the singular cortex, the median septum with both the hippocampus and the ventral hippocampus, and so on. Now, going back to so far, the O information is a measure of interaction information decomposition. On the other hand, we can have a situation in which you want to keep separate redundancy, and synergy. And this is the case of partial information decomposition. Partial information decomposition needs an extra component because Shannon theory cannot accommodate the existence of 4 variables. And so in this case, you need a postulate or a recipe to define redundancy. One common formula is the minimum mutual information, in which redundancy is defined as the minimum of the 2 individual transfer entropy. In this case, the redundancy is not purely due to correlation between the source process, but it can reflect something more profound. And so in this sense, there are relevant things that we can do decomposing the transfer entropy. For example, given 2 items in the complex system, we want to measure the information transfer from a driver to a target, either in a pairwise way or conditioning to all the other variables. We have seen that conditioning is problematic, and we also have seen the case of the higher order hypergraphs containing groups of 3 or 4 or 5 variables. Now, is there a middle way between a pairwise, directed, or conditioned system and a multivariate one? In particular, given a pairwise link, how much of it is due to the environment and how much of it is due to a pure 2-body interaction? So in this sense, we can, given a driver and given a target, we can try to pick up some variables from the rest of the system, trying to maximize or minimize, respectively, the pairwise transfer entropy when we add some variables to the conditioning. So when we minimize the pairwise mutual information, we are picking up redundant variables, and when we maximize the pairwise transfer entropy or mutual information, we are picking up synergistic variables. And so in this case, we can decompose the transfer entropy between pure 2-body effects and then effects due to the environment that can be synergistic and redundant. So this is a simple case of a system of 4 variables where the driver is x1 and the target is x4, and so we can have some pairwise measure, and then you have the pathway that maximizes the synergy and the pathway that maximizes the redundancy. So in this case, we can decompose the pairwise transfer entropy in unique, redundant, and synergistic. This is another application to climate science, in which we ask how much of the transfer entropy from 2 phenomena, El Nino and Southern Oscillation Index, is due to pure 2-body effects. And we can see that this is rather a mediated effect with redundant contribution from the Pacific decadal oscillations and synergistic contribution from the North Tropical Atlantic Index and the Tropical South Atlantic Index. So there is a significant part of the relationship between El Nino to Southern Oscillation due to the rest of the environment. On the other hand, other variables in the environment are not so relevant in transmitting this pairwise information. And then prediction can also be used when assessing feature importance. So for example, if we have many variables that could predict an outcome, so in this case, you have, for example, different, is a problem in particle physics, when you have different observables and you want to discriminate pions and protons, you can either use a pairwise covariate analysis, or a standard in machine learning is using leave one covariate out. And here on the right, so we can see the difference between pairwise and leave one covariate out feature importance. On the other hand, between the variables that are excluded by leave one covariate out because they are not considered relevant by itself, we can see that there are some redundant variables, like the 2 ones here on the right, and also the theta variable on the rightmost one. So we can see that this would explain what is commonly observed in a classification problem, in which one feature alone could be not so informative towards a discrimination task, but combined with others, on the other hand, it could. As a last topic, I would consider the information dynamics as a transition. So we know that when a system is completely disordered, that the information shared is minimum, but also when a system is completely synchronized, the correlation is maximum and synchronization is maximum. But on the other hand, the information transfer goes down again, because when the system is behaving collectively as a whole, we don't need any more knowledge of the driver to predict the target, because the target becomes predictable by itself. So it's logical to think that the maximum of information transfer is between the two states. And now we can look at systems transitioning from order to disorder in a fast way to better disentangle this problem. So again, this is the Ising system, which is also relevant in case of when you want to see whether a system is polarizing, or where stock markets are about to crash, or when we are approaching an epileptic seizure, but also some positive things, such as learning a new language, learning a new pattern, etc. And so a while ago, Matsuda et al. Showed that pairwise and global mutual information peak exactly at the critical point in a lattice of Ising spins. But now, what comes before, the transition or the peak in information theory? So a few years ago, Barnett and colleagues showed that the global transfer entropy peaks in a paramagnetic phase. So global transfer entropy could be seen as a warning sign of a transition to the order. On the other hand, the global transfer entropy involves computing transfer entropy across the system that can be very, very big. And also, it needs dynamical data, so it needs an arrow of time. So can we also have this on static data in case of behavioral scores across several subjects? And also, do we really have to measure all the variables, or we can restrict to a subset? So in this case, we can use, again, partial information decomposition of both the mutual information and of the transfer entropy in unique, redundant, and synergistic component. And doing so, we see that is the synergy that peaks in the paramagnetic phase. Here it's on the left because we have the inverse temperature on the x-axis. So that's why the paramagnetic is on the left. And indeed, the synergy peak approaches the critical point when the amount of synergy decreases. So when the target is the spin 1, the synergy with spins 2 and 3 that are mostly synergistic with respect to spin 1, the peak is more in the paramagnetic phase. On the other hand, considering spins 6 and 3 that are less synergistic, then the peak of the synergy moves towards the critical point. And so in this case, we can have another example of higher order behavior from pairwise links. Now, do we really want to reconstruct a network from observed dynamics? So most methods are meant to disclose the effect and not the mechanism. And then the effect can involve links resulting from non-trivial dynamic effects. So given this duality between mechanism and behavior, unless you have a perfect generative model and you know all the possible confounder, then you can have some spurious links. Now, when is a link actually spurious? A link can be spurious from the point of view of a mechanism, but not from the point of view of behavior, depending on what you would observe. So, for example, if in the frustrated Ising spin you see a higher order behavior, would you say that this is spurious or not? Depend on what is your target properties. And then, of course, conditioning on everything, it's also a bad thing, can be, apart from unfeasible, also problematic in terms of disclosing effects when we don't know exactly whether some variables share information or not. And so ultimately, it's all about the covariance matrix, or if you want, it's nonlinear equivalent. But some things appearing later in neuroscience, such as irreversibility of the arrow of time or the edge time series, all concepts that seem new ones, on the other hand, can be perfectly explained only using the covariance matrix. So modification in the covariance or in the liked covariance can explain most of the network properties or of the predictability properties that we observe, at least in neuroscience, but I'm confident that this is quite generalizable. So ultimately, these are some ideas that you want to take home. First of all, you need to embrace causal thinking in terms of asking the proper questions before asking whether your methods are causal or not. So you have good questions, and then you try to have the best methods to answer those questions. But the question needs to be good rather than before the methods. You need to know your hypothesis, to know your data, and then several types of models, from the data-driven autoregressive ones to the generative models, etc., can be seen as transformation in a state space between unobservables and observed data. Synergy redundancy can be used to study emergence and this dichotomy between segregation and integration, which is present in neuroscience but also outside of it. Usually, redundancy speaks to degeneracy and synergy speaks to cooperation of degrees of freedom. And then some concepts that we normally encounter, such as dimensionality reduction, manifolds, Markov chains, data processing inequality, can also be seen under the umbrella of joint informational content. So thanks, and I'm open to questions.
Yeah, thanks, Professor Daniel. And I think it's a very great talk, and it's quite inspiring to my studies. So, the following is question time. Does anyone has any questions? You can unmute yourself.
I have a question.
Yes.
So I'm thinking about a lot of these problems in the context of social systems, and I'm just wondering what would you say the analogy is between mechanism and behavior over to social systems, right? Where, like, for instance, an economist might make a, like, what I would call a mechanistic model, of interest rate and etc., and and how do we think about that in terms of mechanism and behavior?
So, in wide sense, a behavior is what comes from the observable, even without knowing what is behind it. So, for example, in social sciences, there is this paper by, I don't know, do you still see my screen?
Yeah.
So this one, empirical social triad statistics. So this paper by Stefan Turner group, in which they were studying social triad statistics, such as, for example, the friends of my friends are also my friends, or the enemy of my friends are also my enemies, and things like that. But in this case, they had done a sort of a series of simulations and empirical data acquisitions showing that those statistics can be explained by dyadic interaction, so between only two people at a time. So this, in this case, the mechanism could be what how the information is exchanged across people, so people sitting together around the table, etc. And then the behavior could be how these ideas propagates and spread. Or, for example, in the paper by Thomas Rubiglio that I was mentioning before, they have, for example, a social contagion model in which you can have a group of people connected according to simplicial complexes, or according to basically links. So let's say a mechanism is how you would operationalize a link, which can be either a physical one or something that anyway speaks to the design of your system. And then a behavior is everything that you can deduce by observing the system.
Okay. So kind of like mechanisms are like the constraints on the flow, and then the
Yes.
behavior is like trying to model the flow itself of like whatever moving through it. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
By the way, since you are mostly a network of students or so, please come to the school that we are organizing at the end of August in Sicily. I'm sure that Christian has already circulated the information, also because he will be one of the speakers. But so you have an amazing set of speakers in a very nice place, also in a very nice environment, because it's a small town where you have let's say accommodation and food all together, and it really maximizes interactions, etc. So please make you available for this date. It's just before CCS, so in case you want to go to CCS later, then it's also in Italy. So please consider it, and we will be happy to have you.
Yeah, thanks. We have the information from for our school from Chris already. Yeah. So any other questions about the seminar? Okay, so I do have like one questions.
Yes,
Like you said before in the previous pages that using the term of functional connectivity to describe the simple statistical dependencies might be some problematic because it may confuse the properties we are interested in, like how the brain regions work together with methods we use to infer these properties. So my question is, like, how do you see the difference between the nonlinear estimators, such as the nearest neighbor that you mentioned, and the traditional covariance-based methods in capturing the real neural dynamics? Like, in what circumstances can the nonlinear methods provide a better information that the covariance method cannot obtain?
Yes. So let's say that so you have two dimensions of the problem. So the first one is to have an estimator that works. So for example, even if let's say you are sure that your data are non-Gaussian, even if you are sure that your data are non-linear, yet you could be better served by using a linear estimator, because anyway you would neglect something, but you would be less biased. So at least you would produce some approximation to the interaction, rather than an estimator which would not be able to work because it doesn't have enough data. So this is let's say a practical problem. But on the other hand, of course, if you have an infinite amount of data, or virtually infinite amount of data, then you can certainly use a nonlinear estimator which could accommodate more features of the data. And then there is the dimension of seeing whether you want to exactly find all the interactions. So for example, a time series can be nonlinear, or the interaction itself can be nonlinear, depending on, again, if you don't have access to the mechanism, it's not clear unless you really want to reconstruct the mathematical equations. But this is never the case, because we don't know the equations. And so you can indeed have a toy model in which you say, okay, I compute I first simulate time series according to an autoregressive model, and then I use the autoregressive model to find the coefficients, and then of course you will find them. Or I use a couple chaotic maps, and then I teach an AI or find a linear estimator to see which kind of equation could have generated this. But those are things that are scientifically interesting from the point of view of how a learning system works. But in case in which you have a target system, which is, for example, a biological system, etc., in which you don't know exactly which are the equations governing the systems, then it's anyway a matter of inference. So there is yet another fallacy that sometimes we do when modeling the system. So sometimes we give to the system that we are modeling some properties of the mathematical model. So sometimes we talk about the critical brain, the Bayesian brain, or whatever, just because we are fitting some models that are, for example, if you tune a model close to a critical point, it will better reproduce some dynamics of an actual system. But this doesn't mean that the system itself has some innate criticality inside, unless you are giving to the system a property of the mathematical tool that you are using to analyze it. So it's a matter of navigating the different levels of observables, inference, mathematical tools, etc.
Thanks for the explaining. And do we have any other questions? Yeah, I think is fully understand. Thank you again, Professor Daniele,
Yes,
for
please
sharing the
feel free
content with
to
us.
get in touch whenever you want, and hopefully we will meet soon in real life sometimes.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for
Thanks.
everyone to join us
Thank
today.
you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Bye.